that is a possible scenario. But just the thought of someone so lovely and beautiful, our child, being subjected to something like that was enough to destroy us, and the feelings, the fear, and the images, which I say were so vivid, were very destructive.
On the night of May 3rd, 2007, the resort town of Praia da Luz in Portugal felt as calm as any other evening. A group of British friends sat gathered around a table at the Tapas restaurant, sharing food, wine, and conversation. Just a short walk away, inside apartment 5A, 3 small children slept peacefully. Within the span of less than an hour, that ordinary night would shatter into one of the most haunting mysteries of modern times. When Kate McCann entered the children's bedroom at around 10 p.m., what she saw was the kind of nightmare no parent can ever prepare for. The bed where her 3-year-old daughter Madeleine had been sleeping was empty. The window was wide open, the curtains billowing in the night air. And then came the words that would echo through history. Instead of calling out Madeleine's name, instead of crying questions into the silence, "Where is she? Madeleine, are you here?" Kate screamed a single chilling sentence. "They've taken her." That cry carried down the hallway and out into the night. In that instant, it framed the entire story. It was not presented as confusion, not as a disappearance, but as an abduction. With no evidence yet in sight, the narrative had already been written. The press would amplify it, investigators would chase it, and the world would believe it. But from that very moment, contradictions began to creep in. Contradictions in the details, in the testimonies, in the very foundation of the case. 18 years have passed since that night. Madeleine McCann's disappearance remains one of the most debated, divisive mysteries of our time. Investigators, journalists, experts, and millions of ordinary people have tried to piece together the puzzle. Yet, the more pieces they place on the table, the less they seem to fit. The window was open, yet no signs of forced entry were ever found. Cadaver dogs alerted to the scent of death, yet DNA results came back inconclusive. Witness testimonies overlapped and contradicted each other until the truth itself seemed to blur. Today, when we look back at the case, we don't just see the tragedy of a missing child. We see a story of failure, of evidence that points in 2 directions at once, of a mystery where every answer becomes another question. And above all, the haunting uncertainty remains. What really happened to Madeleine McCann that night? From the very first hours after Madeleine's disappearance, the details of the scene began to unravel under scrutiny. What at first seemed like the clearest evidence of abduction quickly turned into one of the earliest contradictions. Kate McCann described the bedroom window wide open, the curtains moving in the Algarve breeze as though someone had just fled moments before. It was the perfect image of intrusion, the cinematic detail that made headlines across the world. Yet, when Portuguese police examined the window frame and shutters, they found no evidence of tampering, no fingerprints that didn't belong, no scratches, no forced mechanism. If an intruder had entered or escaped that way, he left behind nothing at all. The unsettling possibility arose that the window had been opened from inside, not by a stranger slipping through the dark, but by someone within the apartment itself. Was it a mistake of memory in Kate's panic? Or was the scene deliberately staged to suggest a break-in that never happened? Months later, when immediate hopes of finding Madeleine alive had faded, investigators turned to science. They brought in 2 British specialist dogs, trained to detect the scent of death and human blood. Their work was chilling. In apartment 5A, one dog alerted behind the living room sofa, the distinct signal of cadaver scent. The second indicated traces of blood in the very same spot. For the detectives watching, it was a devastating revelation. If the dogs were right, it suggested that Madeleine had died inside the apartment. But the dogs did not stop there. When brought to the underground parking garage, they reacted again, this time to the McCanns' rented Renault Scenic, a car they had not hired until weeks after Madeleine disappeared. Even more disturbing, the cadaver dog reacted to items of Kate's clothing and to Madeleine's beloved toy, Cuddle Cat, which Kate was often seen carrying in public. For detectives, the implication was unthinkable. Traces of death had traveled with the family into their possessions and vehicle. Yet the promise of clarity soon dissolved into frustration. Forensic samples collected from the apartment and the car were partial, degraded, and inconclusive. Some fragments appeared to match Madeleine's DNA, but none were strong enough to stand in court. What might have been the smoking gun became another cloud of suspicion. Supporters of the McCanns dismissed the dogs as unreliable. Critics argued that trained cadaver dogs rarely make so many consistent mistakes. Instead of delivering certainty, the science split public opinion down the middle. And while investigators wrestled with inconclusive evidence, the family launched the Madeleine Fund, a public appeal that gathered millions of pounds in donations within weeks. For many, it was a testament to tireless determination and hope. For others, as years passed without results, the fund became its own contradiction. How much went toward searches? How much to legal battles against newspapers? Was it truly about finding Madeleine, or about managing the story? From the open window with no forced entry, to the dogs that seemed certain but science could not prove, to the fund that inspired both generosity and suspicion, the first contradictions of the case had already taken root. And with them, the story of Madeleine's disappearance grew darker, more tangled, and far less certain than the world had been told that first night. If the open window and the cadaver dogs cast shadows of doubt, the voices of witnesses only deepened the mystery. In the McCann case, testimonies were never straightforward. They clashed, overlapped, and contradicted each other until the truth became almost impossible to hold. The most famous of these testimonies came from Jane Tanner, one of the friends dining with the McCanns that night. At around 9:15 p.m., she left the restaurant to check on her children. As she walked past apartment 5A, she later claimed she saw a man carrying a small girl in pink pajamas across the street. The child, she said, was barefoot, her pale legs dangling as though she were asleep. On paper, it was explosive, the abductor caught in the act. But problems emerged quickly. Others who were present near the apartment at that exact moment, including Jerry McCann himself, insisted they never saw Tanner pass by, let alone a man carrying a child. How could such a dramatic sighting go unnoticed by everyone else standing only feet away? Police later reconstructed the scene and realized that streetlights, angles, and obstacles might have blocked Tanner's line of sight. Could she really have seen what she thought she saw? While Tanner's account dominated headlines, another testimony would later haunt the case far more deeply. Around 10 p.m., just as Kate McCann was raising the alarm, Martin Smith and his family were walking home from a bar in Praia da Luz. They too saw a man carrying a small blonde girl in pajamas. She appeared to be asleep, draped in his arms as he walked toward the sea. Months later, Smith watched television footage of Jerry McCann returning from Portugal with one of his twins in his arms. The resemblance struck him instantly. The man he had seen that night, he realized, looked uncannily like Jerry himself. This revelation should have been seismic, perhaps even case-defining. Yet, while Tanner's testimony was amplified, the Smiths' account was quietly shelved, downplayed by British authorities, and rarely mentioned in the press. For Portuguese investigators, however, it was far more troubling. A potential turning point that raised the possibility the abduction story was not as clear-cut as it seemed. Why was one sighting celebrated and the other suppressed? Was it simply deemed unreliable, or was it too dangerous to the narrative already cemented? Beyond Tanner and the Smiths, other witnesses added layers of confusion. Some tourists recalled seeing suspicious men lingering near the resort in the days before Madeleine vanished. One couple described a man watching children play near the apartment. Another reported a stranger knocking on doors under the pretense of charity. Yet none of these accounts led to confirmed suspects. Were they fragments of truth, warning signs missed in the chaos? Or were they noise, details remembered only after the world already knew Madeleine was gone? The contradiction between Tanner's and the Smith family's testimonies remains the most haunting divide. One reinforced the story of abduction by a faceless stranger. The other pointed inward, suggesting a darker possibility closer to home. In the McCann case, witnesses were never neutral. Their words became weapons in a battle of narratives, one side reinforcing innocence, the other quietly undermining it. And so, instead of illuminating the truth, the witnesses became part of the darkness. Their contradictions whisper louder than clarity, their testimonies shaping a story that still tilts precariously between two versions of reality. Did Jane Tanner truly see Madeleine in the arms of a stranger? Or did Martin Smith recognize Jerry McCann carrying his own daughter that night? Between these voices lies the fracture that defines the entire case. In any criminal investigation, establishing a clear timeline is crucial. On the night of May 3, 2007, however, every minute became a battlefield of memory, contradiction, and suspicion. The McCanns and their friends, the so-called Tapas 7, claimed they had a system of checking the children every 15 to 30 minutes. On paper, it sounded responsible. In practice, their accounts fractured under scrutiny. At 9:05 p.m., Jerry McCann reportedly left the restaurant to check on his 3 children. He later said that when he entered the apartment, the bedroom door was slightly ajar. He pulled it nearly closed, glanced into the room, and claimed everything appeared normal. Madeleine was in bed, the twins asleep in their cots. He returned to dinner, reassured. But over time, Jerry's descriptions shifted. In some versions, the door was only a little open, nudged perhaps by a draft. In later retellings, it was described as significantly wider, a detail that seemed off. That subtle change, a door slightly ajar becoming wide open, may seem minor, but in a case built on tiny details, it raised troubling questions. If the door was wide open, why didn't Jerry investigate further? If it was only slightly open, why did his memory inflate it later? Around 9:15 p.m., Jane Tanner passed by the apartment on her way back from checking her own children. She claimed she saw Jerry outside chatting with a fellow holidaymaker, while at the same time spotting a man carrying a small girl in pajamas. But the man Jerry was supposedly speaking with later insisted he saw nothing unusual, not even Tanner walking past them. How could one person's dramatic sighting go completely unnoticed by 2 others just a few feet away? By 9:30 p.m., Matthew Oldfield, another friend, said he went to check on the McCann children as well as his own, but his check was strangely incomplete. He admitted he didn't actually enter the bedroom. Instead, he stood at the doorway, saw some light, and thought everything was fine. He didn't physically lay eyes on the children, investigators later asked. How could anyone confirm the safety of 3 small children without actually seeing them? Was Madeleine already gone at this point, and his vague check missed it? Then came 10 p.m. Kate McCann's turn. She entered the apartment and immediately sensed something was wrong. The bedroom door, she later said, stood wider than before. She pushed it open, felt a draft, and saw the curtains moving. Madeleine's bed was empty. The window, she claimed, was open. In her panic, she screamed, rushing back to the restaurant to sound the alarm. But even here, her own words varied. In some versions, she described the curtains billowing dramatically, as though someone had just escaped through the window. In others, she said they were simply drawn aside. Trauma may cloud memory. Or, critics asked, was the story being subtly adjusted as it was retold? Reconstructing the evening became like trying to map shifting sands. The Tapas 7 statements contradicted each other, not just in minor details, but in crucial moments. Who was where, at what time? Who actually saw Madeleine last? Each attempt to fix the timeline only produced more fractures. And so, the central question remains suspended. Who was the last person to truly see Madeleine McCann alive? Jerry at 9:05, Oldfield at 9:30, or Kate at 10? Without certainty, the entire case floats in ambiguity, an hour of shadows in which every timeline is both possible and impossible at once. As the investigation dragged on, suspicion began to shift like a restless tide. First it landed on neighbors, then on strangers, then on known criminals. Each suspect carried the weight of accusation, yet each case collapsed under the absence of proof. The first man to feel the full force of suspicion was Robert Murat, a British expatriate living only a few yards from apartment 5A. In the days following Madeleine's disappearance, Murat volunteered as a translator for police and journalists, moving in and out of the investigation with ease. But soon, his eagerness was viewed with suspicion. A friend of the McCann group claimed to have seen him near the apartment the night Madeleine vanished. Reporters described his behavior as odd, too involved, too present. Portuguese police named him Arguido, a formal suspect. His house was searched, his computers seized, his name splashed across headlines. But as the weeks passed, no evidence tied him to Madeleine. His alibi held, his property yielded nothing, and eventually he was cleared. Though innocent, his life and reputation were scarred permanently. Suspicion then shifted outward, toward the shadows around Praia da Luz. Tourists and locals recalled seeing suspicious men loitering near the resort. One man was reported watching children by the pool. Another was said to be knocking on doors, pretending to collect for charity. Others whispered of burglars active in the area, breaking into holiday apartments. These stories fed into the narrative of a predator lurking in the Algarve. But none of these sightings led to a viable suspect. Police interviewed several men, but none could be placed inside apartment 5A. The figures remained phantoms, frightening but intangible. Years later, however, a name surfaced that seemed to fit the darkness of the story. In 2020, German prosecutors identified Christian Bruckner, a drifter with a violent criminal history, as their prime suspect. Bruckner was already in prison for other offenses, and his record was chilling: child abuse, assault, theft, drug crimes. He lived intermittently in Portugal at the time of Madeleine's disappearance. His phone records placed him in the vicinity of Praia da Luz on the night of May 3, 2007. He owned a camper van that witnesses linked to suspicious activity near the resort. To German authorities, it was enough to publicly declare they were certain Bruckner had killed Madeleine. Yet even here, contradictions prevailed. Despite their bold claims, prosecutors admitted they lacked direct evidence. No DNA, no body, no conclusive link. Bruckner's name became both the perfect and the imperfect answer, the embodiment of menace, but also of uncertainty. For some, he was the monster the world had been waiting to find. For others, he was merely a scapegoat, a convenient ending for a case that refuses to end. Nearly 2 decades later, the trail of suspects is littered with broken names. Murat, innocent but ruined. Anonymous figures, feared but unproven. And Bruckner, condemned in public yet uncharged in court. In the McCann case, even suspects have become contradictions. Both guilty and not. Both answers and dead ends. From the very beginning, the actions of Kate and Jerry McCann were scrutinized as closely as the evidence itself. In any missing child case, parents are expected to collapse under grief, to search desperately, to cry their child's name into the silence. But what the world saw from the McCanns was different, and that difference became one of the most polarizing aspects of the entire investigation. The first decision that drew outrage came before Madeleine even vanished, leaving 3 small children alone in an unlocked holiday apartment while the adults dined at a nearby restaurant. Madeleine was only 3 years old, the twins even younger. The distance from the tapas bar to the apartment was about 50 yards. Close enough, the McCanns insisted, for regular checks to keep the children safe. To many, however, it was reckless, the kind of neglect that created the very conditions for tragedy. For critics, this choice alone spoke volumes. Then came Kate's reaction at 10 p.m. when she found Madeleine's bed empty. Instead of calling her daughter's name, she screamed, "They've taken her!" It was a declaration, not a question, and it set the narrative of abduction before a shred of evidence existed. Defenders said it was the instinctive cry of a terrified mother. Detractors called it too rehearsed, too certain, a line designed to fix the story in the world's mind. In the days that followed, the couple's public image was carefully managed. Kate was photographed constantly clutching Madeleine's soft toy, Cuddle Cat, to her chest. To many, it was heartbreaking, the portrait of a grieving mother holding the last piece of her child. But when cadaver dogs later alerted to the toy, and reports surfaced that Kate had washed it soon after Madeleine's disappearance, critics saw it not as a symbol of love, but as a symbol of suspicion. Was it comfort, or was it destruction of potential evidence? Meanwhile, Jerry presented himself as the steady strategist. He gave press conferences, wrote blog updates, managed communications with an almost clinical composure. Some praised his strength, his refusal to collapse under despair. Others thought he seemed cold, more like a man defending a position than a father mourning his child. Within days, the couple had hired PR advisors. They met world leaders, even the Pope. They launched a fund, appeared in countless interviews, and became the face of a global campaign. Supporters saw this as courage. Parents determined not to let their daughter be forgotten. Critics saw performance, media management, curated photographs, a narrative built for cameras rather than courts. The same gestures that inspired compassion in millions inspired cynicism in others. And so, nearly 2 decades later, the divide persists. To some, the McCanns are victims twice over, first of a cruel abductor, then of relentless suspicion. To others, their every word, every gesture, every decision points to something darker. In the Madeleine McCann case, the parents' behavior was not just background. It became part of the evidence, part of the mystery, inseparable from the question of what really happened that night. Few cases in modern history have been as entangled with media and money as the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. From the very moment the alarm was raised, the story spread across Europe like wildfire. Within days, it was front-page news in Britain, Portugal, and beyond. And within weeks, it had become a global obsession. But in the absence of clear evidence, the narrative was shaped not by facts, but by images, press releases, and the clash of competing voices. At the center of this narrative was the Madeleine Fund, leaving no stone unturned. Launched just weeks after her disappearance, the fund was presented as a vehicle of hope, a way for ordinary people to help find a missing child. Donations poured in, celebrities pledged support, families sent small amounts that added up to millions. At its peak, the fund held a fortune, financing private investigators, international awareness campaigns, and legal actions. For many, it symbolized determination, proof that the McCanns would never stop searching. But as time passed and Madeleine remained missing, questions mounted. Critics noted that large sums were spent on lawsuits against newspapers rather than new investigations. Private detectives hired with the fund's money were sometimes discredited, producing little of value. To some, protecting the parents' reputation became as much a priority as finding the child. The fund, born out of compassion, grew into one of the most controversial aspects of the case, both a lifeline and a lightning rod. The media only intensified these divides. In Britain, coverage was overwhelmingly sympathetic. Headlines painted Kate and Jerry as victims of a botched foreign investigation, emphasizing abduction and downplaying contradictions. Questioning the McCanns too harshly was seen almost as cruelty. But in Portugal, the press took a very different view. Fed by leaks from investigators, they highlighted inconsistencies in the parents' statements, the alerts of the cadaver dogs, the lack of forced entry. To them, the McCanns were not untouchable. They were potential suspects. This split created a war of narratives. In one country, they were grieving parents under siege. In another, they were figures of suspicion shielded by influence. The truth became lost in translation, distorted by national loyalties and media rivalry. And as the years passed, the coverage itself became part of the case, fueling online forums, documentaries, and books that dissected every gesture, every word, every shadow of evidence. The Netflix documentary, The Disappearance of Madeleine McCann, revived global attention in 2019. Slick and dramatic, it reintroduced the case to a new generation. Some viewers thought it reinforced the abduction theory. Others believed it exposed the flaws in the official story. Like everything else connected to Madeleine, it polarized more than it clarified. In the end, media and money did not solve the case. They magnified it, multiplied its contradictions, and transformed it into a spectacle where perception often mattered more than proof. And through it all, Madeleine herself remained missing, the silent center of a storm that never truly passed. 18 years have passed since that night in Praia da Luz, and still the truth about Madeleine McCann remains elusive. What began as a cry of certainty, they've taken her, has unraveled into a maze of contradictions that no investigation has ever been able to resolve. The case is not just about a missing child. It has become a portrait of how silence, suspicion, and competing narratives can swallow the truth. Every piece of evidence seems to point in two directions at once. The open window suggested an abductor, yet bore no signs of forced entry. The cadaver and blood dogs barked with chilling consistency, yet DNA tests whispered only uncertainty. Witness testimonies were divided. Jane Tanner claimed to see a stranger carrying a child, while the Smith family swore they saw a man who looked like Jerry McCann himself. Even the parents' own actions, their decisions, their words, their gestures, became evidence to be dissected, read as both the grief of victims and the performance of deception. The suspects, too, became contradictions. Robert Murat, innocent yet scarred for life. Anonymous figures lurking in memory, feared but never proven. And Christian Bruckner, condemned in public but never charged in court. Each was offered as an answer, and each collapsed into another dead end. The investigations mirrored the same failures. Portuguese police leaned toward the theory of concealment, but lacked proof. British authorities clung to abduction, pouring millions into Operation Grange, yet producing no breakthrough. German prosecutors declared certainty about Bruckner, but could not move to trial. 3 nations, 3 stories, none complete, none conclusive. What remains are the questions that will not die. Was Madeleine truly abducted by a stranger, or did something happen inside apartment 5A? Why was the Smith family's testimony sidelined when it could have changed everything? Were the cadaver dogs right? And if so, why was there no proof to follow? Did the Madeleine Fund serve the search or the story? Every path circles back to doubt. Every answer dissolves into silence. And yet silence is not closure. Silence is not justice. It is the hollow space where truth should be. For 18 years, Madeleine's name has been one of the most recognizable in the world, yet her fate remains invisible. Children have grown up, newspapers have changed, investigators have retired, but her absence remains unchanged. An empty bed in a seaside apartment, a mystery frozen in time. Perhaps the harshest truth is this: a child cannot simply vanish. Something happened that night, a chain of choices and actions that led to her disappearance. The tragedy is not only that those actions were taken, but that nearly 2 decades of inquiry have failed to reveal them. Madeleine McCann's story endures not because it has been solved, but because it never has. Until the contradictions are faced without fear or favor, the silence will continue to echo, and the world will continue to wonder because somewhere, hidden beneath the noise, the truth may already be lying in plain sight.